In a quaint little town, where life seemed to move at its own slow pace, lived an elderly woman named Elena. Her world, filled with memories of love and sacrifice, was suddenly turned upside down when she faced eviction from the home she had cherished for 15 years. With nowhere to turn and no one to help, she found herself on the streets, clinging to the only thing that still connected her to her past, a necklace, a precious memento from her long-lost son. But fate has a strange way of bringing people together, even when all hope seems lost. A month after losing everything, Elena found herself begging on the streets, her dignity slipping away with every passing day. It was in this moment of despair that a chance encounter with a familiar face changed everything. The wealthy landlord who had evicted her, Ricardo, recognized the necklace she held so dearly it belonged to his mother, the very mother he had been searching for all these years. What follows is a tale of heartbreak, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. As they navigate the pain of the past and the challenges of the present, they discover that true wealth lies not in material possessions, but in the love and connection that binds them together. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Elena, a frail elderly woman, was cruelly forced out of the only home she had known for years, all because she had missed a single month's rent. The landlord, Ricardo, a man wrapped in wealth and power, showed no mercy as he evicted her, his heart seemingly as cold as the marble floors of his luxurious estate. He left her with nothing but the haunting echoes of her memories, each one more painful than the last. Weeks later, as Ricardo strolled through the bustling streets, his mind preoccupied with trivial concerns, something caught his eye. There, huddled in a cold, unforgiving corner, was Elena, her once bright eyes now dull and lifeless. She was begging for coins, her hands trembling as they clutched a small, delicate necklace. Ricardo's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the piece of jewelry was his mother's necklace, a symbol of the love and warmth he had long since buried beneath his pursuit of wealth. A wave of devastation washed over him, crashing against the walls of his carefully constructed facade. The necklace, once a beacon of his mother's unconditional love, now lay in the hands of a woman he had condemned to the streets. The weight of his actions bore down on him, and for the first time, he felt the full impact of his callousness. The woman he had discarded like an old, worn-out piece of furniture was not just a tenant, she was a human being, clinging to the last remnants of her dignity. Elena, unaware of Ricardo's turmoil, clutched the necklace tightly to her chest, finding solace in its cold metal. It was all she had left of the son she had lost, the only reminder of a life that had once been filled with love and hope. The streets were harsh, and every day was a battle for survival, but that necklace gave her the strength to endure. It was a symbol of everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed, and now it was the only thing keeping her connected to a past that seemed like a distant dream. Ricardo, standing there, felt his heart shatter. The necklace, a piece of his past, now intertwined with Elena's suffering, became a symbol of the stark contrast between his life and hers. He had everything: money, power, security, yet he realized he had lost something far more valuable: his humanity. At that moment, he saw himself through Elena's eyes, and the reflection was unbearable. He had become the very thing his mother had warned him against, a man so consumed by greed that he had forgotten what it meant to be human. As he turned away, unable to face the devastation he had caused, Ricardo knew that the necklace was no longer just a piece of jewelry. It was a mirror, reflecting the pain and suffering of those he had stepped on in his climb to the top. And no amount of wealth could ever repair the damage he had done. As dusk settled over the city, Elena trudged home, each step heavy with the exhaustion of the day. The small, dimly lit apartment greeted her with an unsettling silence, amplifying the dread that had begun to gnaw at her. "Ricardito," she called out, her voice quivering as a lump formed in her throat. Her heart sank when she found him lying in bed, his small frame trembling with fever. His eyes, once full of life, were now glazed and distant. "Mom," he murmured weakly, his voice barely audible. "I don't feel well." Panic surged through Elena, tightening its icy grip around her chest. She had no money for medicine and no one to turn to for help. The walls of the apartment, once a refuge, now seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with a sense of helplessness she had never felt before. In that moment of despair, a desperate thought crossed her mind. Don Ramon, the neighborhood loan shark. His name was whispered in fear throughout the community, a man known for preying on the vulnerable. But what choice did she have? Elena knew the dangers of dealing with him, yet she couldn't bear the thought of losing her son. With a heart burdened by fear and a mother's unwavering love, Elena wrapped Ricardito in a blanket and ventured out into the night. The streets, usually familiar, now felt ominous, every shadow a lurking threat. But she pressed on, driven by the fierce determination only a mother could possess, willing to face any peril to save her child. As she walked, she clutched the necklace around her neck, the last keepsake from her mother, seeking strength from its cold metal. "Give me strength," she whispered into the night, fully aware that the decision she was about to make would alter their lives forever. The air in Don Ramon's shop was thick with the stench of dampness and despair, a place where hope came to die. Elena stepped inside, her hands trembling, the necklace now a lifeline in her grip. Don Ramon, a man whose smile never touched his eyes, greeted her with a look that sent chills down her spine. "What brings you here, Elena?" he asked, his voice dripping with false kindness, masking the malice beneath. Elena swallowed her fear, standing as tall as she could. "I need money for medicine," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "My son is very sick." Don Ramon's eyes scanned her, lingering on the necklace. His lips curled into a smirk. That necklace would make a fine deposit. Elena's heart ached at the thought. "No," she replied, her voice firm. "Not the necklace. I'll work extra hours, do whatever it takes." The negotiation that followed was tense, every word a battle. When Elena finally walked out, she carried with her the money she needed, but also a debt that weighed heavy on her soul, a debt that threatened to crush her under its weight. She raced to the pharmacy, arriving just before it closed, her breath ragged from the run. With trembling hands, she bought the medicine and hurried back home, where Ricardito lay, his breathing shallow. She administered the medicine, her hands gently stroking his fevered forehead. "You'll get better, my love," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, trying to convince herself as much as him. The night passed slowly, the minutes dragging by as Elena watched over her son, sleep eluding her as she wrestled with her fears. By morning she was exhausted, her eyes shadowed with dark circles. But there was no time to rest, she had to work. At the factory, the familiar clamor of the machines felt more oppressive than usual. As she moved through the hallways, Don Carlos, the leering supervisor, intercepted her. His presence filled the narrow space with a sense of dread. "Elena," he said, his voice too close, his breath hot on her skin. "You look tired. Why don't you come to my office? We could discuss a raise." Her stomach churned with revulsion. She stepped back, her hands clenched at her sides. "No, thank you, Don Carlos," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. "I'm fine as I am." The smile that had played on Don Carlos's lips disappeared, replaced by a cold, hard look. "Think about it," he said, his tone now menacing. "It would be a shame if we had to let you go." Elena felt the world closing in on her, the walls of the factory suffocating her just as the walls of her home had the night before. But she held her ground, knowing that while she had lost much, she would not lose her dignity. She walked away, her steps heavy, her heart burdened with the knowledge that her fight was far from over. But she would endure, because she had to, because Ricardito needed her to. And that, for Elena, was reason enough to face whatever horrors the world might throw her way. Elena spent the rest of the day dodging Don Carlos, her heart a battlefield of conflicting fears, losing her job and failing to care for Ricardito. Every creak in the factory, every leering glance from Don Carlos heightened her anxiety. During her brief break, she found a moment of solace. She pulled out the necklace, letting its familiar weight rest in her palm. It was more than a piece of jewelry, it was a symbol of her mother's unyielding strength, a beacon of hope amid the darkest times. As Elena traced the delicate chain with her fingers, she felt a surge of resilience. Her mother had faced unimaginable hardships with grace and dignity, and now it was Elena's turn to carry that torch. When she returned home that evening, relief washed over her as she saw Ricardito had improved. Though his face was still pale, his energy far from restored. "Mom, why do you work so much?" he asked, his innocent eyes wide with curiosity and concern. Elena pulled him close, feeling the sting of tears she refused to shed. "So you can have a better future, my love," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She clung to him, wishing she could shield him from the harsh realities that loomed just beyond their door. That night, as Ricardito slept peacefully beside her, Elena's mind churned with worry. The small stash of money she had managed to save, coupled with the looming debt to Don Ramon, weighed heavily on her chest, like a stone she could never set down. The thought of selling the necklace crossed her mind, the desperate idea gnawing at her. But as she held it up to the moonlight streaming through the window, the memory of her mother's unwavering determination stopped her. She couldn't let go of the one thing that connected her to the strength she needed now more than ever. "I promise, Mom," she whispered into the silence, clutching the necklace to her heart, "that I'll keep fighting for Ricardito, for you, for us." Outside, the city's hum faded as it drifted into sleep, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding in Elena's tiny apartment. As she finally lay down, exhaustion enveloping her, a steely resolve settled in her heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new struggles, but she would meet them head-on, fueled by the hope that one day Ricardito would have the life she dreamed of for him. Days melted into weeks, each one a relentless march against time. Elena's life became a blur of early mornings and late nights, every moment devoted to scraping together the means to survive. Before the sun had even begun its ascent, she would rise, her body aching with fatigue, to prepare breakfast for Ricardito. Her heart ached each time she left him, knowing she had to face another grueling day under the predatory gaze of Don Carlos, whose intentions grew more insistent and vile with each passing day. One afternoon, while cleaning Dona Mercedes's opulent home, Elena overheard a conversation that sent chills racing down her spine. "Have you heard about the raid in the neighborhood?" Dona Mercedes asked, her voice laced with smug indifference. "They're taking the children of single mothers to orphanages. It's for their good, they say." Elena's heart pounded in her chest, the fear of losing Ricardito tightening like a vise around her lungs. That night, she held him close, her arms a protective barrier against the world that seemed intent on tearing them apart. She whispered promises into his hair, vowing to protect him at any cost, her mind racing to find a way out of the nightmare that was closing in on them. Meanwhile, the debt to Don Ramon continued to grow, a shadow that darkened every moment of her life. His goons began to appear more frequently, their presence a constant reminder of the threat hanging over her. "Remember, Elena," one of them hissed, his voice dripping with menace. "Don Ramon always collects his debts, one way or another." Desperation clawed at her as she sought more ways to earn money. She took a night job at a seedy bar, enduring the leers and crude remarks of customers who saw her as nothing more than a means to their ends. Each tip she earned was a step closer to freedom, but the cost to her spirit was immeasurable. One day, as she dragged herself home after another long shift, she was shocked to find Ricardito sitting on the steps of their building, his small hands holding out sticks of gum to passers-by. "What are you doing, my love?" she asked, her voice breaking with a mix of surprise and heartbreak. "I want to help you, Mom," Ricardito replied, his voice small but resolute, his eyes shining with a determination that both broke and uplifted her heart. "I know you work hard for me." Elena's strength crumbled as she collapsed beside him, pulling him into a fierce embrace. Tears flowed freely as guilt gnawed at her soul. What kind of life was she giving her precious boy? What kind of mother was she, letting him bear the weight of their struggles at such a tender age? That night, as Ricardito slept soundly, Elena took out the necklace once more. She held it up to the pale moonlight, each gem reflecting the remnants of a life she had once hoped to provide for her son, a life that now seemed more out of reach than ever. The necklace shimmered with memories of love, of a time when her mother had whispered words of hope and strength into her ear. "What should I do, Mom?" she whispered, her voice choked with desperation, seeking answers from the inanimate object that had become her only confidant. It was then that she made a decision that tore at the very fabric of her being. With trembling hands, she dug through old papers until she found the card of an adoption agency that had once been thrust upon her. The thought of it sent waves of pain crashing over her, but she saw no other way. "Forgive me, my child," she sobbed, her voice barely audible as she looked at Ricardito, his small chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. "Maybe this is the only way to give you the life you deserve." The decision weighed on her like a boulder, crushing her spirit. But Elena knew that sometimes love meant making the hardest choices, doing the unthinkable for the sake of those you love. With her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, she began to plan the most excruciating step of her life, hoping that one day Ricardito would understand and, perhaps, forgive her. The morning arrived with a heaviness unlike any Elena had ever known. Each movement, each breath was a struggle, laden with the unbearable weight of the decision she had made. She moved through the motions of the day, her mind numb, her heart a hollow shell of the fierce love that had driven her to this point. But beneath the despair, a sliver of hope remained, a hope that somehow her sacrifice would give Ricardito the future she had always dreamed of for him. Ricardito, blissfully unaware of the emotional tempest brewing within his mother's heart, sat at the breakfast table, chattering excitedly about his plans for the day at school. Every word he spoke, every innocent smile, was like a sharp blade twisting deeper into Elena's already broken heart. She watched him closely, committing every detail to memory, the way his unruly hair flopped over his forehead, the tiny milk stain clinging to the corner of his lips, the untainted sparkle of innocence in his eyes. Each small gesture was a bittersweet reminder of the love she was about to surrender. "Ricardito, my love," Elena said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed, "today, you're not going to school. We're going somewhere special." The boy looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Where are we going, Mom?" Elena forced a smile, a fragile mask that barely concealed the anguish within. "It's a surprise," she replied, the words catching in her throat as she tried to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. As they made their way to the adoption agency, Elena felt as though each step was leading her closer to an unfathomable abyss. Ricardito, blissfully unaware of the looming heartbreak, skipped alongside her, his laughter echoing in the crisp morning air, a painful contrast to the darkness enveloping Elena's soul. When they finally arrived at the agency, Elena's legs felt like lead, her heart shattering with every beat. She stopped in front of the building, unable to take that final, irrevocable step. "Ricardito," she said, her voice quivering as she fought to keep it steady, "you're going to stay here for a little while. These people, they will take very good care of you." The boy's cheerful expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. "But what about you, Mom? Aren't you coming with me?" Elena's heart wrenched as she struggled to find the right words. I will come back for you, my love. I promise," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of the lie she was telling, a lie she hoped against hope would one day become the truth. As the agency worker gently took Ricardito's hand and led him inside, Elena felt her soul being torn from her body. Her heart screamed in protest, begging her to stop this, to hold him tight and never let go. But she remained frozen, her feet cemented to the ground as she watched her world slip away. With trembling hands, she removed the necklace from around her neck, the last vestige of her own mother's love, and tucked it into Ricardito's small backpack. "So you'll always have me close," she murmured, even though he was already too far away to hear her. The heavy doors closed behind him, sealing the chasm that had just opened in her life. Elena stood there, paralyzed, as the tears she had fought so hard to contain finally broke free, streaming down her face. She collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving sidewalk, her body racked with sobs, oblivious to the concerned glances of passers-by. In that moment of utter despair, she made a vow to move heaven and earth, to reclaim her son, no matter how long it took, no matter the cost. She would find a way back to him, even if it took a lifetime. The years that followed were a relentless march of suffering and sacrifice for Elena. Each day without Ricardito was a fresh wound, a constant ache that never dulled. She worked herself to the bone, scrimping and saving every penny, driven by the faint hope that one day she would be able to provide her son with the life she had always dreamed of for him. One gray, dreary afternoon, as she was cleaning a wealthy family's home, Elena stumbled upon a photograph that made her world stop. The image showed a bright, smiling teenager posing with his adoptive parents, radiating happiness. Though time had passed, Elena instantly recognized the eyes staring back at her Ricardito's eyes. Her heart raced as she turned the photograph over, reading the inscription in a trembling whisper. Ricardo Montero, 15 years old. A wave of emotion crashed over her: hope, joy, fear, and an overwhelming sense of disbelief. After so many years, she finally had a clue about her son's whereabouts. That night, in the solitude of her tiny, rented room, Elena cried tears of both joy and agony. Her son was alive, he appeared to be thriving, but he was so far beyond her reach. She was torn apart by the desire to rush to him, to embrace him and never let go, and the gnawing fear that her sudden reappearance might shatter the life he had built without her. The days that followed were nothing short of torture. Elena discreetly began gathering information about Ricardo's life, her heart pounding with every discovery. She learned that the Montero family was among the most influential in the city, owners of vast properties and successful businesses. The more she uncovered, the more her heart ached with the realization that Ricardo was living a life so far removed from the one she had once known. But deep within her, the fierce love of a mother refused to let go. She knew the path ahead would be treacherous, but the thought of seeing her son again, of holding him in her arms, gave her the strength to press on, no matter the risks, no matter the pain. One afternoon, driven by an unbearable longing, Elena ventured into the affluent neighborhood where the Montero family resided. The mansion loomed before her, a testament to the life of privilege and luxury that her son now enjoyed. She stood at a distance, her heart heavy with a mixture of pride and sorrow, as she imagined the life he led within those grand walls. Just as she was about to turn and leave, a young man emerged from the house. It was Ricardo. Elena's heart nearly stopped as she saw him. Her son, now a grown man, carried himself with the ease and confidence of someone who had never known hardship. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and Elena held her breath, her soul aching with the hope that he might recognize her. But Ricardo simply walked past, his gaze indifferent, not knowing that the woman before him was the mother who had sacrificed everything for his future. That night, back in the solitude of her tiny room, Elena took out an old photograph of Ricardito as a child. She studied it carefully, mentally comparing it to the young man she had seen earlier. The resemblance was undeniable, yet they seemed worlds apart: the innocent boy she once knew and the composed, distant man who had walked by her without a second glance. "Did I do the right thing?" Elena whispered to herself through tears. The doubt gnawed at her like a relentless beast. Should she reveal herself to him? After all these years, did she have the right to disrupt the life he had built without her? The night stretched on, each hour a torment as Elena wrestled with her emotions. She was torn between the fierce love of a mother and the fear of shattering the carefully constructed world her son now inhabited. The thought of being rejected, of seeing confusion or even disdain in Ricardo's eyes, was too much to bear. As dawn began to break, casting a pale light into her room, Elena made a decision. She would not step into Ricardo's life. She had no right to intrude after all this time. But she would find a way to be close to him, to watch over him from the shadows, protecting him in whatever small ways she could. "My child," she murmured to the old photograph, "even if you don't know me, I will always be here, watching over you." With that silent vow, Elena began to plan how she could remain a part of Ricardo's life, her love hidden but ever present, the secret she bore both a comfort and a burden. As time continued its relentless march, Elena, now with silver hair and hands roughened by years of hard labor, became an almost invisible presence in the Monteros' world. She found work as a gardener on a nearby estate, which allowed her to observe Ricardo from a distance. Each morning, as she tended to the roses and trimmed the hedges, she would watch her son leave for work, dressed in immaculate suits, stepping into his sleek car with the air of someone perpetually in a rush. Elena's heart swelled with both pride and sorrow. The little boy she had once cradled in her arms was now a man, a successful one at that, but also one she barely recognized. One day, as Elena was quietly working in the garden, she overheard a heated argument that froze her blood. The voices, coming from the Monteros' garden, were unmistakable. Ricardo and his adoptive father were locked in a bitter confrontation. "You can't keep doing this, Ricardo, mister." Montero's voice rang out, laced with anger and frustration. "Your decisions are destroying this company. Don't you care about the legacy of this family?" Elena, hidden behind a thick bush, listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. Ricardo's response, sharp and filled with bitterness, cut through the air. "Legacy," he spat, his voice cold. "All you've taught me is how to be ruthless and greedy. Is that the legacy you want me to uphold?" Elena's breath caught in her throat. The sweet, innocent Ricardito she had known seemed to have vanished, replaced by a man consumed by ambition and bitterness. The argument continued, each word revealing more about the life Ricardo had led, a life shaped by wealth, power, and the moral compromises that came with them. He had become someone she had never imagined, cold, calculating, and driven by a desire for control and dominance. As Elena listened, her heart broke anew. What had her son become? The little boy who once clung to her skirts, who had laughed with pure joy and cried with unfiltered emotion, was now a man entangled in a world of cruelty and greed. The realization was like a dagger to her soul, twisting with the knowledge that her sacrifice, meant to save him, had led him down a dark path. In the days that followed, Elena's sorrow deepened. She continued her work, silently observing Ricardo from a distance, each day bringing new glimpses of the man he had become, successful, yes, but seemingly hardened by the very success she had once dreamed of for him. Despite her pain, she remained resolute. She had made her choice, and she would honor it. Even if Ricardo never knew her as his mother, Elena would always be there, a silent guardian, watching over him with a love that time and distance could never diminish. That night, in the solitude of her small room, Elena wept bitterly, her sobs echoing off the walls. The anguish that gripped her was unbearable, a suffocating realization that perhaps her decision to give him up for adoption had played a role in transforming Ricardo into the man he had become, a man so distant from the loving, innocent boy she once knew. The following days were an agonizing blur for Elena. Every time she saw Ricardo, she searched his eyes, desperately hoping to catch a glimpse of the child he used to be. But all she found was a cold, steely ambition that seemed to have replaced the warmth she once cherished. One afternoon, as Ricardo strolled through the garden, inspecting the work she had done, he walked past Elena without so much as a glance. Her heart ached with the weight of unspoken words, and before she could stop herself, she called out to him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and desperation. "May I tell you something?" Ricardo stopped and turned to look at her, his expression one of indifference. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone impatient. Elena swallowed hard, gathering every ounce of courage she had. "I just wanted to say that life is more than money and power," she began, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Sometimes love and compassion are more valuable than any fortune." For a fleeting moment, something seemed to flicker in Ricardo's eyes, a hint of softness, perhaps a memory long buried, but just as quickly, it was gone. He straightened, his face hardening once more. "Save your advice, woman," he replied coldly. "You know nothing about my life with that." He turned and walked away, leaving Elena standing there, her heart shattering anew. How could she reach him? How could she show him the path of love and compassion that she had always dreamed for him? Tears welled up in Elena's eyes as she watched him disappear into the distance. She knew then that she could no longer stand by and do nothing. No matter how long it took, she would find a way to remind Ricardo of who he truly was, even if it meant revealing the truth she had kept hidden for so many painful years. Autumn arrived, painting the city in rich hues of gold and crimson. The changing leaves mirrored the time passing by, and with each day, Elena felt the weight of her years pressing down on her more heavily. Despite her weariness, she continued to work in the gardens near the Montero mansion, her heart torn between the desire to reach out to Ricardo and the fear of the consequences that might follow if she revealed her true identity. One chilly morning, as Elena was sweeping up the fallen leaves, she noticed a well-dressed woman arriving at the mansion. It was Sofia, Ricardo's wife. Elena watched her with quiet curiosity, noting the tension in Sofia's posture and the way her eyes seemed to search for something beyond the grandeur of the house. Sofia paused for a moment at the edge of the garden, her gaze locking with Elena's. There was a brief, almost imperceptible moment when it seemed as though Sofia might speak, but then the moment passed, and she walked into the house, leaving Elena with an unsettling sense of foreboding. A few days later, while tending to the roses, Elena overheard a conversation between Ricardo and Sofia in the garden. Their voices were low, but the strain in their words was unmistakable. "You can't keep going like this," Sofia implored, her voice tinged with worry. "You're pushing away everyone who cares about you. What happened to the man I fell in love with?" Ricardo's reply was as cold as the autumn air. "That man was weak," he said with bitter resolve. "The business world doesn't forgive weakness." "But at what cost?" Sofia pressed, her voice breaking with emotion. "You're losing your humanity, Ricardo." Elena's heart clenched as she listened. The sweet, loving Ricardo she had once known seemed completely lost, replaced by a man hardened by the very life she had hoped would bring him happiness. That night, unable to find solace in sleep, Elena pulled out the old photo album she had treasured for so many years. Each page held memories of a time when her son was full of life and when his laughter filled her world with light. How could she help him remember that child? How could she guide him back to the path of love and compassion? With a trembling hand, Elena picked up a pen and began to write a letter. She poured her heart onto the page, recounting the story of a mother who had been forced to give up her son in the hope of providing him with a better life. She wrote of the love that had never faded, the yearning that had only grown stronger with each passing day, and the hope that one day fate would bring them back together. She expressed her deepest wishes for him to find love and kindness within himself, to remember the warmth and compassion that had once been the core of his being. The next day, with her heart pounding in her chest, Elena slipped the letter into the Montero's mailbox. She knew she was risking everything: her anonymity, her secret, the delicate balance she had maintained for so long, but she could no longer bear to watch her son spiral further into the cold, ruthless world he had created for himself. She had to reach him, somehow, even if it meant exposing the truth that had weighed so heavily on her heart for all these years. As she walked away from the mansion, Elena felt a mix of fear and hope. Would Ricardo read the letter? Would he understand? Would he finally remember the love that had once filled his life? Only time would tell, but Elena knew she had done all she could. She would continue to watch over him, praying that one day he would find his way back to the person he was always meant to be. As Elena walked away from the mailbox, she couldn't resist the urge to glance back at the mansion one last time. Her breath caught in her throat as she thought she saw Ricardo standing by a window, his gaze distant, his expression unreadable. For a fleeting moment, Elena wondered if he had somehow sensed the invisible thread of connection that still bound them together, despite all the years and miles that had come between them. She hurried back to her small, humble room, her heart heavy with hope and fear, whispering prayers that her words might penetrate the barriers of time, circumstance, and perhaps even Ricardo's hardened heart. The days that followed were an excruciating test of patience for Elena. Every sound outside her window, every rustle of leaves, made her heart leap with anticipation. She lived on the edge, waiting for some sign, any sign that her letter had reached Ricardo and stirred something within him. But life at the Montero mansion continued as it always had, with no outward sign that anything had changed. The silence was deafening, and each passing day felt like an eternity, filled with doubt and second-guessing. Then, a week later, something shifted. As Elena was tending to the garden, she noticed Ricardo stepping out of the mansion. But instead of heading straight to his car, as was his routine, he hesitated. His eyes swept across the garden, and for a brief moment they rested on Elena. Her heart pounded in her chest as their gazes met, and she thought she saw a flicker of recognition, perhaps even conflict, in his eyes. But just as quickly, Ricardo turned away, shaking his head slightly before getting into his car and driving off. That afternoon, as Elena continued her work, she was startled to see Sofia, Ricardo's wife, walking towards her. There was a mixture of curiosity and something gentler, perhaps concern in her expression. "Excuse me," Sofia began, her voice careful. "You've been working here for quite some time, haven't you?" Elena nodded, trying to keep her composure despite the fear and hope battling within her. "Yes, Ma, many years." Sofia hesitated, as if choosing her next words carefully. "By any chance, did you leave a letter in our mailbox last week?" Elena felt the world slow to a standstill. The moment she had both dreaded and longed for had arrived. Her voice was barely a whisper as she replied, "Yes, that was me." Sofia's eyes softened with a mix of emotions: compassion, curiosity, and something akin to understanding. "Is it true? Are you?" Elena's tears finally broke free, the weight of years of secrecy and longing too much to bear. "Yes," she confessed, her voice trembling, "I am Ricardo's mother. I gave him up for adoption many years ago." Sofia looked at her with a mixture of empathy and confusion, her mind trying to process the revelation. "Ricardo, read your letter," she said gently. "He's been different since then. More reflective, more human." Elena's heart swelled with cautious hope. "He knows I'm here." Sofia shook her head slowly. "Not yet. He's struggling with what he's feeling, trying to make sense of it all. But I believe he needs to hear the whole truth." Just then, the sound of a car pulling up the driveway interrupted their conversation. Ricardo had returned home earlier than usual. Panic gripped Elena as she realized how close she was to being discovered. "Please," she begged, her voice urgent and raw, "don't tell him you spoke to me. I need to be the one to talk to him." Sofia nodded, understanding the gravity of Elena's request. "I understand," she replied softly, "but don't wait too long. Ricardo needs answers, and he needs them soon." As Sophia walked back towards the house, Elena remained rooted to the spot, her body trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. She watched through the garden's foliage as Ricardo entered the house. This time, when their eyes met through the window, there was something different, something that made Elena feel, for the first time in years, that her son was truly seeing her. It was as though the veil of indifference had lifted, even if just a little, allowing a glimpse of the boy she had once known and loved so deeply. Elena's heart beat with renewed determination. She knew the moment of truth was approaching, and when it came, she would be ready to face it, ready to reclaim the connection that had been lost but never broken. That night, alone in the quiet of her small room, Elena made a decision that had been years in the making. Tomorrow, she would tell Ricardo the truth. No more hiding, no more secrets. The time had come to reveal what had been buried for so long. Her heart was a storm of fear and hope, but she knew that she could not wait any longer. The next day would change everything for both of them. Morning arrived with a heaviness in the air, as if the world itself sensed the gravity of what was to come. Elena dressed with care, choosing the best blouse she owned, one she had saved for special occasions. Her hands shook as she combed her hair, each stroke bringing her closer to the moment she had imagined and dreaded for decades. By the time she arrived in the garden, her heart was pounding in her chest, each beat echoing the tension that had built up over the years. She waited, the minutes stretching out like hours, her nerves frayed with anticipation. Every rustle of leaves and every distant sound made her jump. Finally, near noon, she saw Ricardo step out of the house. This was it, the moment she had both longed for and feared. Summoning all the courage she had, Elena approached him, her heart in her throat. "Mr. Ricardo," she called softly, her voice trembling. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Ricardo stopped, his expression a mix of curiosity and wariness. "What do you want?" he asked, though his tone was gentler than before. Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It's about the letter you received last week," she began, her voice almost failing her. Ricardo's eyes widened in shock. He started, but his voice faltered. "Yes," Elena confirmed, tears already beginning to pool in her eyes. "I wrote that letter. Ricardito, I am your mother." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ricardo stared at her, his face a canvas of emotions: disbelief, confusion, anger, and a deep, hidden fear that seemed to rise from the depths of his soul. "No," he finally managed to say, his voice trembling with the force of his denial. "This can't be true." "It is true," Elena continued, her tears now flowing freely. "The Montero family adopted you when you were 10 years old. I had to give you up for adoption. I was young and poor, and I couldn't give you the life you deserved." Ricardo recoiled as if the words were blows, stepping back as if to distance himself from the painful reality she had just revealed. "Why now?" he demanded, his voice a mix of anger and deep hurt. "Why after all these years?" Elena extended a trembling hand towards him but stopped short, afraid to touch him, afraid of being rejected. "I've been near you all this time," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion, "watching over you from afar. But when I saw what you were becoming, I couldn't stay silent any longer." Ricardo's face hardened, a shield of coldness coming down over his features. "What do you know about what I'm becoming?" he challenged, his voice cutting. "I know that you're not happy," Elena replied softly, searching his eyes for the boy she once knew. "I know there's goodness in you, the goodness of the child you were." For a long moment, Ricardo stared at her, his face a battleground of conflicting emotions. It seemed as though he wanted to say something more, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he turned abruptly and walked away, his steps quick and determined, as if fleeing from a truth too painful to face. Elena stood frozen in place, watching her son disappear into the house once more. But this time, despite the fresh wave of pain that crashed over her, she felt a small, flickering spark of hope. The truth was out there now. No matter how deeply buried, it had been spoken. Now all she could do was pray that her love could break through the walls Ricardo had built around his heart. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Elena. Each morning she arrived at the garden with a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest, hoping to catch a glimpse of Ricardo, longing for another chance to speak with him. But he was nowhere to be found, his absence hanging over the estate like a heavy cloud. Every passing day felt like a missed opportunity, and the weight of unspoken words pressed down on Elena, making her daily tasks feel more burdensome than ever. One afternoon, as Elena was carefully pruning the roses, she noticed Sofia approaching her with a cautious, worried expression. The signs of sleepless nights were evident in her eyes, and there was a softness in her voice when she spoke. "Elena," Sofia began, her tone gentle but filled with concern, "Ricardo hasn't been well since he learned the truth." Elena's heart sank, fear and guilt washing over her in waves. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sofia sighed, glancing back towards the house before continuing. "He's been struggling more than ever before. He's withdrawn, barely speaking to anyone. I think he's trying to come to terms with everything, but it's tearing him apart." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes once more. The last thing she had ever wanted was to cause her son more pain. "I never wanted to hurt him," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I just wanted him to know the truth, to understand." Sofia reached out and gently touched Elena's arm. "I know," she said softly, "and I think deep down Ricardo knows that too. But he needs time, and he needs to hear from you again. The letter was a start, but it wasn't enough." Elena nodded, her mind spinning with the implications of Sofia's words. The truth was out, but the path to healing was far from clear. Ricardo needed her now more than ever, but the question remained, how could she reach him without causing further harm? As Sofia walked back towards the house, Elena stood amidst the roses, the thorns pricking at her fingers, reminding her that love, like the flowers she tended, was both beautiful and painful. But she would endure it all if it meant bringing her son back to the light, back to the love that had never once wavered, even in the darkest of times. Elena's heart sank as she heard Sofia's words. "Is he very angry?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear and uncertainty. Sofia shook her head gently. "No, it's not anger," she reassured Elena. "It's confusion. He's questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. He barely eats, barely sleeps, and spends hours locked in his study, looking at old photographs." Elena felt the familiar sting of tears threatening to overflow. "I never wanted to cause him pain," she whispered, her voice thick with regret. "I know," Sofia replied softly, placing a comforting hand on Elena's shoulder. "And I think deep down Ricardo knows that too. But he needs time to sort through all of this." As they spoke, they were unaware that Ricardo was watching them from his study window. His gaze shifted from Elena to Sofia, his mind a turbulent sea of memories and emotions, each one pulling him in a different direction. That night, sleep eluded Elena. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of worry, hope, and guilt. Unable to bear the silence any longer, she left her room for a walk, her feet carrying her instinctively to the Montero mansion. She stopped in front of the large gate, staring at the illuminated house that had once seemed so unreachable. Suddenly, a movement in the garden caught her eye. It was Ricardo. For a long moment, they stood still, separated by the iron bars of the gate, but connected by an invisible bond that neither time nor distance could break. Elena held her breath, fearing that any movement might shatter the fragile moment they shared. Finally, Ricardo spoke, his voice barely audible in the stillness of the night. "Why? Why didn't you look for me before?" The vulnerability in his tone was a stark contrast to the hardness she had come to expect, and it pierced Elena's heart like a dagger. "I tried." she replied, her voice trembling with emotion, "Many times. But I was always afraid of ruining the life you had, afraid that you would hate me for abandoning you." Ricardo remained silent, his face unreadable in the dim light. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the house, leaving Elena standing alone in the cold night air. As she watched him disappear into the warmth of the mansion, she felt a bittersweet mix of pain and hope. This was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward reconciliation, but for the first time in years, she felt there was a chance, however small, of getting her son back. Autumn slowly gave way to winter, and with it came a chill that seeped into Elena's bones. She continued her daily routine in the garden, though now each movement was tinged with a heightened awareness of the fragile connection she had begun to rebuild with Ricardo. She knew he sometimes watched her from his study window, but he never approached, and she respected his need for space, even as she longed for more. One particularly cold morning, Elena arrived at the garden to find something unexpected on the bench where she usually rested. A small box sat there, waiting for her. With trembling hands, she opened it and found a new coat inside, warm and of fine quality. There was no note, but Elena didn't need one to know who it was from. As she put on the coat, tears welled up in her eyes, not from the cold, but from the gesture of care it represented. Just then, Sophia appeared, her smile gentle and understanding. "It was Ricardo's idea," she said softly. "He said he couldn't allow his mother to be cold." Elena's heart skipped a beat at the word mother. It was the first time Ricardo had acknowledged her as such, even indirectly. "He's struggling," Elena Sophia continued, her voice full of compassion. "Part of him wants to get closer to you, to know you, but another part is afraid. Afraid that if he lets you into his life, he'll lose you again." Elena nodded, her heart heavy with understanding. "I'll wait," she said with quiet determination. "I'll wait as long as it takes." That afternoon, while Elena was working in the garden, she sensed a presence behind her. She turned to see Ricardo standing a few meters away, his expression tense and conflicted. "The coat," Elena began, but Ricardo quickly interrupted her. "I don't want you to get sick," he said, his voice tight with emotion. After a moment's hesitation, he added, "I remember the necklace, the one you gave me when you left me. I lost it years ago on a business trip. I've never felt so devastated by losing something." Elena's heart ached, filled with both sorrow and hope. Ricardo, she corrected herself, the old nickname slipping from her lips naturally. "That necklace belonged to your grandmother. I gave it to you so you would always have a piece of your family with you." Ricardo looked at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Why did you give me up for adoption?" Elena took a deep breath, knowing this moment was pivotal. "Because I loved you too much to condemn you to a life of poverty and hardship. I wanted you to have opportunities that I couldn't provide." Ricardo closed his eyes as if the weight of her words was too much to bear. When he opened them again, Elena saw a glimpse of the boy he once was, the boy she had loved with all her heart. "I need time," he finally said, his voice raw with emotion. "I need to process all of this." Elena nodded, her heart full of understanding. "Take all the time you need," she said gently. "I'll be here waiting." As Ricardo turned and walked away, Elena felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there were many obstacles yet to overcome, but for the first time, she felt that they were no longer separated by an insurmountable distance. They were on the path to healing, and she would be there for him every step of the way, no matter how long it took. As Ricardo walked away, Elena felt a shift in the air. A door that had once been firmly shut was now ajar, just enough to let in a sliver of light. And that small change was enough to keep hope alive in her heart. Spring arrived, bringing with it a fresh burst of life in the garden and a subtle transformation in the atmosphere at the Montero mansion. The once cold and distant presence that Ricardo had embodied seemed to soften with the changing season. Elena noticed that he spent more time at home, often lingering on the terrace, watching her as she worked among the flowers and plants. It was as if he was trying to bridge the gap between the past and the present, between the life he had known and the truths he was beginning to uncover. One morning, while Elena was busy planting new flowers, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Ricardo approaching, his movements hesitant but filled with a quiet determination. I'd like you to tell me about my childhood," he said, his voice a blend of curiosity and uncertainty, as though he wasn't quite sure what he wanted to hear. Elena's heart raced, a mixture of joy and fear flooding her chest. "Of course," she replied, her smile trembling with emotion. "What would you like to know?" Ricardo sat down on a nearby bench, gesturing for Elena to join him. Everything he said simply, the weight of the word hanging in the air between them. Over the next few hours, Elena poured her heart out, sharing stories from Ricardo's early years, the years they had spent together before life had pulled them apart. She spoke of how she used to sing him to sleep every night, the lullabies that had comforted him as a baby. She recounted the day he spoke his first word, how his laughter had filled their small home when she tickled him. Each memory seemed to chip away at the wall Ricardo had built around himself, revealing glimpses of the boy he had once been. At one point, Ricardo interrupted, his voice tinged with nostalgia. I remember a park," he said, his eyes distant as he searched his memories. "There was a swing. You pushed me, and I felt like I could touch the sky." Elena nodded, tears filling her eyes. "The Oak Park," she said softly. "We went there every Sunday. It was our little escape from the world." Ricardo looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions, longing, sorrow, and something like understanding. "Why didn't you fight harder for me?" he asked, the raw pain in his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Elena felt as though her heart was breaking all over again. "I did fight, Ricardo," she whispered, her voice heavy with the weight of the years. "I fought with everything I had, but we were so poor. The debts, the threats. I was young and so scared. I thought giving you up for adoption was the only way to save you, to give you a chance at a better life." Ricardo was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable as he processed her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter and more reflective. "All my life, I felt this emptiness, like something vital was missing. Now I understand why." At that moment, Sophia appeared on the terrace, watching the scene unfold with a mix of surprise and relief. Ricardo glanced at her, then back at Elena. "I need time to process all of this," he said as he stood up, his tone steady but strained. "But thank you for telling me, for being here." As Ricardo walked back toward the house, Elena felt a bittersweet mixture of sadness and hope. She knew the path to reconciliation would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time in years, she believed it was possible. Sophia approached Elena, her hand resting gently on the older woman's shoulder. "It's a start," she said softly, her eyes kind and understanding. "A good start." Elena nodded, her gaze fixed on the house where Ricardo had just disappeared. "A start," she echoed, her voice filled with quiet determination. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to dream of a future where she and Ricardo could rebuild their bond, where they could be a family again. The days turned into weeks, and Elena began to notice small but significant changes in Ricardo. He no longer carried the same cold, distant demeanor that had once defined him. Sometimes she caught him looking at her with a thoughtful expression, as if he were trying to reconcile the image of the elderly gardener with the fragmented memories of his childhood. One afternoon, while Elena was carefully pruning the roses, she noticed Ricardo approaching, a photo album clutched in his hands. His expression was softer, more open than she had ever seen it. "I found this in the attic," he said quietly, holding the album out to her. It's full of photos from when I was a child, right after the adoption. I thought maybe you'd like to see them." Elena's breath caught in her throat as she took the album from his hands. The cover was worn, the pages slightly yellowed with age. As she opened it, her fingers trembling, she was greeted by a flood of images, snapshots of a life she had missed, moments of her son growing up without her. There were pictures of Ricardo as a little boy, smiling shyly at the camera, playing with toys, and blowing out candles on a birthday cake. Each photo was a glimpse into a life that had been both a blessing and a sorrow for her. Ricardo sat down beside her, the two of them sharing a quiet moment as they flipped through the pages together. "I don't remember a lot from those years," Ricardo admitted softly, "but seeing these, it brings some of it back." Elena smiled through her tears, her heart aching with a mix of joy and regret. "I'm so grateful you had a good life," she said, her voice full of emotion. "But I'm even more grateful to be here with you now." Ricardo nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before. "I still have a lot to work through," he said honestly. "But I want to know more about you, about us. I want to fill in the gaps." Elena reached out and gently placed her hand on his. "We'll do it together," she promised, her voice steady with the certainty that, at long last, they were on the path to healing. And so, as spring continued to blossom around them, too did the fragile bond between mother and son, nurtured by time, patience, and the enduring power of love. Elena felt her heart stop for a moment as she took the album from Ricardo's hands, her fingers trembling. As she flipped through the pages, she saw her little Ricardito growing up before her eyes: birthday parties, days at the beach, school graduations, a whole life that had unfolded without her. Each photograph was a bittersweet reminder of the years she had missed, the moments she had only imagined. "You were such a happy child," Elena murmured, her vision blurring with tears as she tried to absorb the images. Ricardo sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the photos. "I was," he admitted quietly. "My adoptive parents gave me a lot of love." Elena felt a sharp pang of pain, but she forced herself to smile. "I'm glad," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's all I ever wanted for you." Ricardo looked at her, his eyes filled with an emotion that Elena couldn't quite decipher. "But I always felt like something was missing," he confessed, his voice softer, more vulnerable. "Now I understand what it was." As he spoke, a strong wind suddenly swept through the garden, tearing several leaves from the trees. One of the leaves, yellow and fragile, landed gently on the open photo album. Ricardo picked it up, holding it between his fingers as if it were something precious. "I remember," he said slowly, as if recalling a distant memory, "a song you used to sing to me, something about autumn leaves." Elena's breath caught in her throat. "The autumn leaves," she whispered, her heart aching with the weight of the past. "It was your favorite lullaby." Without thinking, Elena began to hum the familiar melody, her voice soft and soothing. To her surprise, Ricardo closed his eyes, a look of peace washing over his face as he listened. It was as if the music was a bridge to the past, connecting them in a way words never could. When the song ended, Ricardo opened his eyes, a single tear escaping and rolling down his cheek. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice filled with gratitude and something else, something deeper, like a thread of connection finally being rewoven. As he got up to leave, Ricardo paused, looking back at Elena with a mix of hesitation and resolve. "Mom," he said, the words sounding both foreign and right on his lips, "I'd like you to come to dinner with us tonight. Sophie and I, we want to get to know you better." Elena felt a wave of joy so profound it nearly took her breath away. "I'd love to," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. As Ricardo walked away, Elena looked down at the photo album in her hands, then back at the figure of her son as he disappeared into the house. For the first time in many years, the emptiness in her heart began to fill with the warmth of hope and the promise of a future they could share. The road to reconciliation would be long and challenging, but now, more than ever, Elena believed it was possible. That evening, the Montero mansion was filled with an air of nervous anticipation. Elena, dressed in her best clothes, felt slightly out of place in the luxurious dining room. The elegant surroundings, with their crystal chandeliers and fine china, contrasted sharply with the simple life she had led. Sophia, with her natural warmth and kindness, did her best to ease the tension, engaging Elena in light conversation and offering reassuring smiles. Ricardo, however, alternated between moments of openness and reservation, as if he were still grappling with the enormity of the situation. "Tell us more about yourself," Elena Sophia said gently, pouring a glass of wine for Elena. "Ricardo mentioned that you've worked in many different places before becoming a gardener." Elena nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the silverware. "Yes, that's right," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I was a waitress, a seamstress, a housekeeper, whatever was necessary to survive." Ricardo looked at her intently, his eyes searching for something in her words. All that after he let the question hang in the air, unable to bring himself to directly mention the adoption. "Yes," Elena replied softly, lowering her gaze. "It was difficult, but the memory of you gave me the strength to keep going." A heavy silence fell over the table, the weight of unspoken feelings pressing down on them all. The clinking of silverware against plates was the only sound that broke the stillness. Suddenly, Ricardo stood up abruptly, excusing himself with a mumbled apology before quickly leaving the room. Elena felt her heart plummet. Had she said something wrong? Had she pushed him too far? Sophia, noticing her distress, reached out and placed a comforting hand on Elena's arm. "Give him a moment," she said softly. "This is hard for him." Minutes passed, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity. Finally, Ricardo returned, holding a small, weathered box in his hands. He sat down and opened it carefully, revealing an old, worn necklace inside. "I found it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The necklace you gave me. I thought I had lost it, but it was in an old box in the attic." Elena's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the family heirloom, the same necklace she had given to Ricardito so many years ago. "Oh, Ricardito," she whispered, the diminutive slipping out before she could stop it. Ricardo carefully lifted the necklace from the box, his hands trembling slightly. "All my life, I felt a connection to this necklace without understanding why. Now I know," he said, his voice breaking as he looked at Elena. "I think it should go back to you." Elena shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks as she reached out to touch the necklace. "No, my love," she said, her voice filled with tenderness. "I gave it to you so that you would always have a part of me with you. It's yours." Ricardo looked at the necklace for a long moment, the weight of the past pressing down on him. Then, he looked back at Elena, and in his eyes she saw a glimpse of the boy he once was, mingled with the man he had become. "Maybe," he said slowly, "we could share it, a symbol of our past and perhaps our future." Sophia, who had been watching the scene unfold with tears in her eyes, raised her glass, her voice soft and full of emotion. "To the family," she said, her words carrying a quiet strength. "To the bonds that neither time nor distance can break." Elena, overwhelmed with emotion, lifted her glass, her heart full of hope and gratitude. As she clinked her glass against Sophia's and Ricardo's, she felt the warmth of their connection, a connection that had been tested by time and pain, but had not been broken. The road ahead would still be difficult, with many challenges to face, but for the first time in years, Elena allowed herself to believe that they could rebuild what had been lost, that they could be a family once more. Elena felt the warmth of the embrace, the sensation of belonging that she had longed for, wrapping around her like a protective blanket. As they stood together, united in their shared moment of vulnerability and strength, the rain continued to fall softly, almost as if it were a blessing, a cleansing of all that had been painful and unresolved. "And now what?" Sophia asked, her voice tender and full of curiosity, as she pulled back slightly from the embrace, looking up at Ricardo with both anticipation and love. Ricardo looked thoughtful for a moment, the weight of his decision and the future he had just set in motion clearly in his mind. But there was also a new lightness in his expression, a sense of relief and possibility. He glanced at Elena, who smiled at him with a mixture of pride and hope, and then back at Sophia. "I think," Ricardo began slowly, choosing his words with care, "that it's time for us to figure out what truly matters. I've spent so much of my life chasing after things that, in the end, didn't make me happy. But now, with the company behind me, I want to focus on what matters: our family, our life together." Sophia smiled, tears of joy shining in her eyes. "That sounds perfect," she said, her voice full of emotion. Elena felt a deep sense of contentment as she listened to Ricardo. The boy she had loved so deeply, the man he had become, was finally embracing the values she had always hoped he would love: integrity and the importance of family. It was as if a circle had been completed, the past and present merging to create a future that was built on the strength of these relationships. Ricardo continued, his voice growing more confident. "I want to take some time to think about what comes next, to explore what I'm passionate about and what makes me feel fulfilled. And I want to do it with both of you by my side." Elena felt her heart swell with pride and love. "Whatever you choose to do, Ricardo, know that we're here for you," she said, her voice filled with the unwavering support only a mother could offer. Sophia nodded in agreement. "Yes, we'll figure it out together," she said. "We have everything we need right here." For the first time in a long time, Ricardo allowed himself to truly believe in a future where happiness wasn't tied to success or power, but to the simple, yet profound, joy of being with the people he loved. The rain began to let up, and the clouds parted just enough for a soft, golden light to break through. It cast a gentle glow over the garden, where new roses were beginning to bloom, symbols of the new life and new beginnings that lay ahead. "Let's go inside," Ricardo suggested, his tone light, almost playful. "We'll make plans over a warm meal and then, who knows, maybe we can take a trip somewhere together, just to celebrate this new chapter." Sophia and Elena smiled, the idea of starting fresh and creating new memories together filling them both with a sense of anticipation. As they walked back toward the house, arm in arm, Elena couldn't help but feel that this was what she had been waiting for all these years: a chance to be a family, to share in the joys and challenges of life together. As they stepped into the warmth of the mansion, leaving the rain and the cold behind, Elena allowed herself to fully embrace the happiness that had eluded her for so long. The journey to reconciliation was not over. It would be a lifelong process, full of ups and downs, but they had taken the first steps, and they had taken them together. And now Elena thought to herself as they settled around the table, "We begin anew, with love as our guide and hope as our constant companion." With that, she allowed herself to dream of all the beautiful moments yet to come, confident that this was only the beginning of a future filled with love, understanding, and the unbreakable bonds of family. As they stood in front of the small house, Elena felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her. The modest home, nestled among the autumn-colored trees, symbolized everything she had dreamed of: a fresh start, a simpler life, and most importantly, a chance to be a family again. Ricardo turned to Elena, his expression soft and full of warmth. "Now," he said with a smile that reached his eyes, "we start again, together." Elena's heart swelled with joy, a joy she hadn't experienced in decades. The path to reconciliation had been unexpected, filled with twists and turns, but now she knew they were truly on the road to a future filled with love, hope, and the promise of a new beginning. The days following the sale of the company had been a whirlwind of emotions and change. The news of Ricardo's decision spread quickly, and the Montero mansion had become the focal point of intense scrutiny. Journalists, former business partners, and curious onlookers all clamored for details, eager to understand why a man of Ricardo's stature would abandon everything he had built. One morning, as Elena was tending to the garden, she heard raised voices coming from inside the house. Concerned, she approached cautiously and found Ricardo engaged in a heated argument with a man in an elegant suit. "You're crazy, Ricardo," the man, who Elena recognized as Carlos, a former business partner, shouted angrily. "You've thrown away everything you've worked for your entire life." Ricardo, surprisingly calm, responded firmly, "No, Carlos, I've done the right thing. And that's what matters now. I've regained my life." Carlos, noticing Elena's presence, turned and looked at her with disdain. "And all for this old woman, your so-called mother." His words dripped with contempt, causing Elena to feel a chill run through her. Before Elena could react, Ricardo stepped forward, his posture protective. "Watch what you say," he warned, his voice carrying a cold fury that left no room for argument. Carlos sneered but laughed bitterly. "You're not worth my time, Ricardo. Enjoy your new life of poverty with that." He turned and walked away, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Ricardo turned to Elena, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right, Mom?" Elena nodded, touched by her son's protective stance. "I'm fine, but it's true, Ricardo. You've lost so much because of me." Ricardo took Elena's hands in his grip firm and reassuring. "I haven't lost anything that truly matters," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "I've gained something far more valuable, a second chance with you, with Sophia, and with life." At that moment, Sophia entered the garden, holding a letter in her hand, her face showing signs of worry. "Ricardo," she said, her voice trembling, "it's from the bank. They're calling in the mortgage on the house." Ricardo's face paled briefly, but then a strange calm settled over him. He looked at Elena, then at Sophia, and finally at the garden that surrounded them. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "it's time for a new beginning, a true one." Elena and Sophia exchanged confused glances, unsure of what Ricardo meant. He continued, "All my life, I've been surrounded by luxuries I didn't need. Maybe it's time to live in a simpler, more authentic way." Sophia, after a moment of surprise, smiled softly. "You know what? You're right. This house has never really felt like a home." Elena, feeling a surge of determination, spoke up. I have some savings. It's not much, but it could help us start anew." Ricardo looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and emotion. "Mom, you don't have to." "I want to," Elena interrupted gently. "We're family, aren't we?" Ricardo nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "Yes, we are." As the sun set over the garden, casting a warm glow over the three of them, they sat on the porch and began planning their future. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, they all felt they were on the right path, a path that would lead them to true happiness and the deep family connection they had longed for. Autumn gradually gave way to winter, and one day, the three of them stood in front of a small house on the outskirts of the city. It was modest compared to the grandeur of the Montero mansion, but it had a rustic charm and a large garden that made Elena's heart flutter with excitement. "Are you sure about this?" Ricardo Elena asked, her voice filled with concern as she looked at the house. Ricardo nodded, a serene smile on his face. "More sure than ever, Mom. This is our new beginning." Sophia, carrying a box of belongings, joined them on the porch. "It's perfect," she said, her eyes full of affection as she gazed at the house. As they unpacked and began to settle in, Elena couldn't help but notice the changes in Ricardo. His face, once marked by tension and seriousness, now seemed more relaxed. The hard lines of ambition that had once defined him were softened, replaced by a peaceful contentment. His eyes, which had once reflected only the pursuit of success, now shone with a new light, a light that spoke of love, connection, and the simple joys of life. That night, as they sat around the table in their new home, sharing a simple meal, Ricardo looked at Elena and Sofia, his heart full. "Now," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination, "we start again, together." Elena smiled, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. For the first time in many years, she felt a deep, unshakable sense of peace. The road to reconciliation had been long and difficult, but they had made it through, stronger and more united than ever. The future was filled with uncertainty, but also with hope, a hope that they would face whatever came next as a family, bound together by love, understanding, and the promise of a new beginning. That night, as they sat around the simple table in the kitchen, sharing the dinner Elena had lovingly prepared, Ricardo spoke from his heart. "You know, all my life I believed that success was measured by money and power, but now I realize I was wrong." Elena and Sofia looked at him, waiting for him to continue, sensing the weight of his words. "True success," Ricardo said, his voice filled with conviction, "is this being here with the people I love, being authentic with myself." Sofia squeezed his hand, her eyes brimming with tears of pride and love. "I'm so proud of you, Ricardo." Elena, her heart swelling with a love she hadn't felt in decades, added softly, "Your father would be proud too." Ricardo looked at her, surprised. "My father? You've never told me about him." Elena took a deep breath, knowing it was time to open another chapter of her past. "Your father was a good man, Ricardo. He loved us very much. But life was hard on us. He passed away when you were very young, just before I had to give you up for adoption." A deep silence filled the room, heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Ricardo stood up and wrapped his arms around Elena, pulling her into a warm embrace. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for telling me this, for being here now." As they pulled apart, Elena noticed something around Ricardo's neck. It was the old necklace she had given him so many years ago. Her breath caught in her throat. "You're wearing it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Ricardo touched the necklace gently, reverently. "Always," he replied. "It's my connection to the past and my anchor in the present." That night, as Elena prepared to sleep in her new room, she felt a profound peace wash over her, a peace she hadn't experienced in decades. The road had been long and fraught with pain, but now, after so many years, she had her family back. The future was uncertain, but Elena knew that together they could face any challenge that came their way. With a contented smile on her lips, she closed her eyes, grateful for the second chance that life had granted her. Spring arrived, bringing with it a burst of new life in the garden that Elena had carefully cultivated at their new home. Ricardo, once a man driven by ruthless ambition, now found joy in simpler things. He spent his mornings helping his mother plant flowers and vegetables, the physical work grounding him in a way he had never known before. One morning, as they worked side by side in the garden, Ricardo suddenly paused, a serious expression crossing his face. "Mom," he began, his voice filled with emotion, "there's something I need to tell you." Elena straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart racing with anticipation and a touch of fear. She waited for him to continue, sensing that whatever he was about to say was deeply important. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," Ricardo said, his eyes focused on the soil beneath his feet. "About how my life has changed since I found you, and I've realized something important." Elena watched him closely, her heart swelling with both pride and love. "I want to use the money I have left from the sale of the company to do something good," Ricardo said, his voice steady and resolute. "I want to open a support center for single mothers and at-risk children." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Ricardito," she whispered, overwhelmed by the depth of his transformation. I want to prevent other families from going through what we went through, Ricardo continued. I want to give hope to those who believe they have no options. At that moment, Sophia came into the garden, holding an envelope in her hand. Ricardo, Elena, she called out, this just arrived. Ricardo took the envelope, his expression shifting from surprise to joy as he read the contents. It's from the bank, he said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. They've approved the loan for the center. Elena felt her heart swell with pride and love. This was her son, the man she had always believed he could become, now fully realized. There's something else, Ricardo added, his eyes shining as he looked at Elena. I want the center to be named after you, Mom, the Elena Montero Support Center. Elena couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She hugged Ricardo tightly, feeling as if all the years of separation and pain were melting away at that moment. Sophia joined the embrace, and for a few precious moments, the three of them stood there, united by love, hope, and a shared vision for the future. When they finally pulled apart, Ricardo took Elena's hands in his voice soft with gratitude. Thank you, Mom, he said. Thank you for not giving up on me, for showing me the true meaning of love and family. Elena looked around at the flourishing garden, the modest but warm and welcoming home her son and her daughter-in-law. Her heart overflowed with gratitude and happiness. No, my love, she replied, her voice full of emotion. Thank you for giving me this second chance and for allowing me to be your mother again. As the sun shone down on them, Elena knew that this was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with love, forgiveness, and the promise of a better future, not just for them, but for all the families they would help through the center. And so, in that flourishing garden, a symbol of rebirth and hope, the story of Elena and Ricardo found not an end, but a new and beautiful beginning. As we come to the end of this video, we hope you've gained valuable insights and knowledge. What have you learned so far? We'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment to share one thing you've learned and how you plan to put it into practice in your life. Your feedback is important to us, and it helps create a community of learners who inspire each other. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.